With the HVAC zones created, it's now time to edit the thermal properties of each HVAC zone. There are 5 main parameters we'll examine and edit for each HVAC zone. And those parameters are the service type, the coil bypass, the cooling information, the heating information, and the outdoor air information. To start with, the service type parameter is what kind of system is serving the HVAC zone, whether it's a constant volume system or an active chilled beam system or essential heating hot air system. For the AHU-100 HVAC zone, let's select the VAV terminal reheat system. The next parameter is the coil bypass parameter, which sets the percentage you can bypass your coil in the load calculations. We will set this parameter at 30%. Moving on to the cooling information parameter, there are 3 values to edit within this parameter. The cooling set point value, which is the temperature you want the HVAC zone to be at. We will set this value to 72 degrees. The cooling air temperature value, which is the temperature that will be delivered to meet the cooling air set point. Let's set this value to 55 degrees. And then lastly, there's the humidification control value. To edit the default setting, select the checkbox and then change the number. We will set the humidification to 50%. Within the heating information parameter, you have 3 similar values as you did in the cooling information parameter. There's the heating set point value, the heating air temperature value, and the humidification control value. These 3 values do the same thing for heating as their cooling counterparts values did for cooling. So for the AHU-100 HVAC zone, set the heating set point value to 70 degrees and the heating air temperature value to 95 degrees and the humidification set point value to 50%. The 5th parameter is the outdoor air information parameter, and this parameter has 3 values associated with it, but these values work differently than the heating and cooling information parameters. All 3 values in the outdoor air parameter by default are unchecked, and if the value is left unchecked, then Revit will ignore that information when calculating the loads. If you have multiple values checked, then Revit will evaluate each of the values the load calculations generate and use the worst case between the values and the load calculations. So, if you want Revit to not account for outdoor air per person, or outdoor air per area, or air changes per hour, then leave the box next to that value unchecked. For the AHU-100 HVAC zone, we're going to check all 3 and set the air change per hour value to 4 and set the outdoor air per area value to 0.06 and the outdoor air per person value to 15. Now moving on to the AHU-101 HVAC zone. The service type parameter will be set to VAV-terminal reheat. The coil bypass parameter will be set to 30%. The cooling information parameter will be 72 degrees for the cooling set point, 55 degrees for the cooling air temperature, and 50% for humidification control. The heating information parameter will be 70 degrees for the heating set point, 95 degrees for the heating air temperature, and 50% for humidification control. And in the outdoor air information parameter, we're only going to check the outdoor air per person and the outdoor air per area values. The outdoor air per person value will be 15, and the outdoor air per area value will be set to 0.06. With all the parameters set for all the HVAC zones, it is time to run our heating and cooling loads. So, on the Analyze tab, on the Reports and Schedules panel, select the Heating and Cooling Loads button, and this will launch the Heating and Cooling Loads dialog box. Now within this dialog box there are 2 tabs. You have the General tab and the Details tab. And also within this dialog box is a visual representation of the MEP spaces and HVAC zones within the Revit model. The General tab has the overall information concerning the model in it. Now some of this information has already been edited, while a few parameters still need to be addressed. The building infiltration class parameter has 4 options to choose from: loose, medium, tight, and none. This parameter accounts for the air leakage of the building. For these calculations, we will set this parameter to none. The report type parameter has 3 settings to it: simple, standard, and detailed. The report type parameter setting determines how much load data Revit will show you on the report that is generated. Let's set this parameter to simple for now. Next, verify that the building type parameter is set to office. This parameter addresses the occupancy of the building. Check that the ground plane parameter is set to level 1. The ground plane parameter determines which MEP spaces Revit sees as underground and which ones are above ground. And since MEP spaces in HVAC zones are phase specific, make sure the project phase parameter is set to the correct phase. In this case, make sure the project phase parameter is set to new construction. Now moving over to the Details tab, this tab has information specific to the HVAC zones and MEP spaces. When you select on one of the HVAC zones, the dialog box will show you all the heating, cooling, humidification, and outdoor air data that has been inputted for that zone. Another feature is while the HVAC zone is selected, the 2 buttons on the right side of the dialog box allows you to highlight or isolate the HVAC zone in the illustration on the left side of the dialog box. Expanding the HVAC zones will show you the list of MEP spaces assigned to that HVAC zone. And when you select one of those MEP spaces, Revit will show the thermal data that has been assigned to that space. And just like the HVAC zones, the MEP space has the feature to highlight or isolate using the buttons on the right side of the dialog box. But with an MEP space, you can also review any warnings related to it. And now that all the information in the heating and cooling loads dialog box has been set, let's select the Calculate button, and Revit will generate the load report. The load report that was just generated can be found in the project browser under Reports, Load Reports. And Revit names this report Load Reports (1). This is the default name Revit gives its load reports, and the number is just in sequence to which load report's been ran. Though this numbering and this naming makes sense to Revit, it's helpful to rename the reports to something more descriptive for future reference. For this report, we will rename it to Load Report Simple. To rename the load report, just right-click on the load report name, and on the pop-up menu, select Rename. To have a better understanding of what Revit provides in a simple, standard, and detailed load report, let's go back into the Heating and Cooling Loads dialog box by selecting the Heating and Cooling Loads button that's on the Reports and Schedules panel under the Analyze tab, and change the report type parameter from Simple to Standard, and then select the Calculate button again to create a standard load report. And just as before, for clarity's sake, right-click on the report name and select the Rename command, and then rename this report to Load Report-Standard. And then finally, go back into the Heating and Cooling Loads dialog box by selecting the Heating and Cooling Loads button on the Reports and Schedules button under the Analyze tab again, and change the reports type parameter from Standard to Detailed this time, and select the Calculate button once again to generate a detailed load report. And same as before, rename this report to Load Report Detailed. Now that you've created all the types of load reports Revit has to offer, you can now compare the information Revit provides in each report.